They laughed as I explained my new business idea, calling it another one of Morgan's little projects. My father-in-law, Richard, raised his crystal glass, the same one I'd gifted them last Christmas. Maybe this time you'll make enough to cover more than just the groceries, he chuckled, exchanging knowing glances with my husband Jason. Little did they know that I'd already secured $2 million in seed funding, and the investors they dismissed as Morgan's imaginary friends included 2 Silicon Valley veterans who had backed 3 unicorn startups in the last decade. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled politely and took another sip of my water, maintaining the mask of the dutiful daughter-in-law they expected. In their eyes, I was just Jason's wife, the woman who'd left a stable career in corporate marketing to play entrepreneur with my sustainable home goods company, EcoNest. What they didn't know was that my little project had just been valued at $15 million, and tomorrow I would be signing the papers on a distribution deal that would triple our revenue by next quarter. My relationship with the Fosters began 8 years ago when I met Jason at a charity auction. He was charming, with a confident smile and stories about his work as a financial advisor. I was 4 years out of college and had just left my corporate job to start my own business. Back then, EcoNest was just a concept, sustainable home goods made from reclaimed materials, but I believed in it fiercely. When I met Jason's parents, Eleanor and Richard Foster, at their sprawling lakefront home in Westridge, they seemed impressed by my corporate background, but visibly deflated when I mentioned leaving it to start my own company. "Such a brave decision," Eleanor had said, the concern evident in her voice. "But at least you have Jason to fall back on." That became their refrain over the years, that Jason was my safety net, my provider. They never asked about my business, beyond polite inquiries that quickly turned into recommendations about real jobs I should consider. In the early days of our marriage, Jason had been supportive, at least outwardly. "They just worry," he'd explain after another dinner filled with subtle digs. "They want security for us." So I made a decision. I would downplay my business success around them. At family gatherings, I spoke vaguely about making progress and learning experiences. When EcoNest secured our first major retail partner, I mentioned it as a small opportunity. When we expanded to a proper warehouse facility, I called it a space share with other small businesses. It was easier this way, maintaining the narrative they had created rather than challenging their perception of me. 3 years into our marriage, things began to shift with Jason. The subtle support gave way to jokes at my expense. "Morgan's playing shop again today," he'd tell his friends when I couldn't attend their golf outings. When I worked late nights to fulfill a major order, he'd sigh dramatically about being a business widower. I noticed how he emphasized his role as the breadwinner when speaking to others, casually mentioning his year-end bonus or the clients he'd secured, while my business became his amusing anecdote. What Jason and his family didn't know was how strategically I'd built EcoNest. Our sustainable manufacturing processes had caught the attention of major retailers looking to green their supply chains. Our carbon-neutral shipping methods had been featured in industry publications. The reclaimed wood side tables that Richard had once called garage sale material were now back-ordered for 6 months with luxury retailers. I had kept a careful separation between my personal and business finances from day one. My business partner, Zoe Chen, had insisted on it. "Never mix family and business finances," she'd warned, having learned the hard way through her own divorce. So while Jason knew I was making sales, he had no idea of the scale. Our prenuptial agreement, which he had actually insisted upon to protect his assets, had become my protection instead. As EcoNest grew, I continued living modestly. The company profit was consistently reinvested. I drove the same mid-range sedan I'd had since college. I didn't upgrade my wardrobe with designer labels Not out of deception, but because those things simply weren't important to me. My passion was building something sustainable, both environmentally and financially. The dynamic with my in-laws deteriorated further when they retired 5 years into my marriage with Jason. They had always lived extravagantly: country club, memberships, luxury cars, lavish vacations. But as Richard's retirement approached, whispers of financial concerns began to surface. Eleanor would make comments about the outrageous cost of living and how their retirement accounts weren't what they should be. Richard had worked as an executive at a commercial real estate firm, living the high life of corporate America in the 80s and 90s. They had expected their golden years to be filled with the same luxuries they had always enjoyed. But poor investments and a lavish lifestyle had apparently taken their toll. Still, they maintained appearances, buying a new Mercedes the same month Richard cleared out his office. Last Christmas, things came to a head when Eleanor cornered me in the kitchen during their annual holiday party. "The Andersons are spending 3 weeks in Switzerland this winter," she said, refilling her wine glass. "We always used to take trips like that. But now, with Richard retired..." She let the implication hang in the air, her eyes fixed on me expectantly. "That sounds lovely," I replied neutrally, continuing to arrange the cheese platter. "Well, Jason mentioned that your little craft business might actually be doing okay now," she continued, emphasizing craft in a way that diminished 8 years of grueling work. "He said you might even be ready to contribute more to the family." "You? No, beyond just covering your personal expenses." I nearly dropped the knife I was holding. Jason and I had always split our household expenses proportionally based on our incomes, or what he thought was my income. We had separate accounts and investments by his choice initially. He had never expressed any concerns about my contribution. "I'm not sure what you mean, Eleanor," I said carefully. She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how family works, dear. When some members succeed, they help others maintain their quality of life. Richard gave Jason so many advantages: private, school, connections for his first job, the down payment for your house. Now that you're finally finding some success, it's time to show your gratitude." I maintained my composure, but inside, a resolve was hardening. The down payment she mentioned had been a loan that we, mostly I, had repaid within 2 years. The connections for Jason's job had been a single introduction. His subsequent promotion to senior financial advisor had nothing to do with his father. Yet the narrative of endless family obligation remained unchallenged. That evening, I overheard Jason and Richard talking in the study, their voices slightly raised after several glasses of Richard's expensive scotch. Scotch I had actually gifted them from the proceeds of my little craft business. "It's not like she can't afford it now," Richard was saying. "If her company is doing as well as you say, it's time she stepped up. Your mother and I want to do that Alaskan cruise this summer. It would be a perfect gift from both of you." "I'll talk to her," Jason replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't the first such conversation. "She can be a bit tight with money. Still has that small business mentality, you know? Doesn't understand how family support works at our level." I slipped away silently, my mind racing. Their level? Our level? The presumption was staggering. But more disturbing was realizing that Jason had been discussing my business with his parents, apparently exaggerating its success to elevate his own status, while simultaneously setting me up as the target for his parents' financial expectations. That night, as we drove home in silence, I made my decision. The facade had served its purpose while EcoNest grew, but now it was time. The distribution deal I would sign tomorrow would be public knowledge soon enough. My company was about to become too visible to downplay. More importantly, I was tired of the dismissal, the condescension, and now the entitlement. As I pulled into our driveway, our house that my business had actually paid off last year without Jason's knowledge, I turned to my husband of 8 years and said, We need to talk about your parents' retirement plans and exactly what role you think I should play in funding them." His confident smile faltered. "Oh, they were just talking. You know how they get after a few drinks." "No," I said firmly. "I think it's time we had complete transparency about expectations and about finances. All of them." Jason laughed nervously. "What's there to be transparent about? We know where we stand financially." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Do we?" I asked quietly. "Do we really?" The confusion on his face would have been amusing if the situation weren't so serious. Tomorrow would change everything. But tonight, I reviewed the documents my lawyer had prepared, detailing exactly how the financial boundaries would be drawn, not just with my in-laws, but with Jason himself. After years of being underestimated, it was time for the truth to come out, and for me to reclaim my narrative. Morning dawned crisp and clear, a perfect day for changing the course of my life. Jason had already left for work, avoiding the continuation of our conversation from the night before with a mumbled excuse about an early client meeting. Typical. Whenever difficult discussions loomed, Jason became suddenly overwhelmed with work obligations. I opened my laptop at the kitchen island and logged into my secure email. Zoe had already sent over the final distribution agreement with Wellspring Cooperative, a national chain of high-end department stores focused on sustainable products. Their initial order would double our production, and the projected sales would increase our valuation significantly. More importantly, it would make EcoNest impossible to dismiss as a little hobby any longer. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, my personal assistant whom Jason believed was just a friend who helps out sometimes. In reality, Lisa managed my hectic schedule and had been instrumental in coordinating the complex logistics behind our expansion. Conference room booked for 10 a.m., legal team standing by. Wellspring executives confirmed. Good luck today. I smiled, thinking of the careful groundwork I'd laid over the past 6 months. After overhearing Richard and Jason's conversation, at Christmas, I had accelerated plans that had been simmering in the back of my mind. First, I had quietly consulted with Diana Warren, a financial advisor from a competing firm to Jason's, to get a complete picture of our financial situation. Mine, Jason's, and what I could piece together about the Fosters. Diana's analysis confirmed my suspicions. While Jason and I lived well within our means, his parents had accumulated significant debt maintaining their luxurious lifestyle post-retirement. Their home equity line of credit had been maxed out. They had already refinanced their lakefront property twice. Their investment portfolio showed several ill-advised withdrawals, likely to cover lavish expenses like their Mediterranean cruise last spring or the country club membership they refused to relinquish. More troubling were the regular transfers, from Jason's personal account to his parents over the past 2 years, amounts that increased steadily as their financial situation deteriorated. Money that I had assumed was going toward our joint financial goals was instead propping up Richard and Eleanor's unsustainable lifestyle. Yet our household expenses were still split proportionally, with me contributing what Jason believed was a fair share based on what he thought my business earned. The irony was almost painful. My next step had been legal protection. I met with Lydia Morris, a sharp-eyed attorney specializing in both business and family law. Together, we had strengthened the already solid separation between my personal and business finances. We updated my will, created a comprehensive estate plan, and established crystal-clear documentation of all assets acquired before and during my marriage. Your prenup actually works in your favor, Lydia had noted during one of our meetings. But these additional protections ensure that your business remains exclusively yours, regardless of any family pressures. While I wasn't planning for divorce, I wasn't naive. The conversation I was about to have with Jason could go several ways, and I needed to be prepared for all of them. The third and most difficult preparation had been emotional. I had spent years playing small to accommodate my husband's ego and his parents' narrow expectations. Breaking that pattern wouldn't be as simple as signing papers or revealing bank statements. It would require a fundamental shift in how I presented myself and my accomplishments. For this, I had worked with Caroline Bennett, a formidable executive coach who specialized in helping women step into their power. Our weekly sessions had focused on everything from body language to verbal responses to emotional resilience in the face of pushback. They're going to try to make you feel guilty, Caroline had warned. They'll call you selfish, ungrateful, not a team player. They'll say you've changed, and they'll mean it as an accusation. Prepare for that emotionally, and know that standing your ground isn't selfish. It's necessary. My final preparation had been practical. 2 months ago, I had opened a new checking account at a different bank and gradually moved a reasonable portion of my personal savings there, not out of fear that Jason would take my money, but to establish a clear separation before our conversation. I had also secured a small apartment downtown, paid 3 months in advance. Again, not because I necessarily planned to leave, but because having options was essential to negotiating from a position of strength. As I sipped my coffee, I reviewed the folder I'd prepared for today's conversation. It contained documentation of EcoNest's current valuation, our major contracts, press coverage from industry publications, and a detailed breakdown of my personal contributions to our household over the years. It also contained records of Jason's transfers to his parents, information I had legally obtained as his spouse with access to our tax records, showing exactly how much of our money had been diverted to maintaining Richard and Eleanor's lifestyle. My phone buzzed again, this time an email from Wellspring's CEO, Marcus Reynolds. Looking forward to officially welcoming EcoNest to the Wellspring family today. Your vision for sustainable home goods aligns perfectly with our customer base. This partnership marks the beginning of an exciting new chapter. I allowed myself a moment of pride. This was what 8 years of relentless work looked like. Not a hobby, not a cute little business, but a multi-million-dollar company poised for national distribution. I had built this while being consistently underestimated, and perhaps that had been my greatest advantage. No one saw me coming. At precisely 9 a.m., my phone rang. It was Eleanor Foster. "Morgan, dear," she began without preamble. "I was thinking about our conversation at Christmas. Richard and I have been looking at Alaskan cruises for July. The good cabins are booking up quickly. Should we go ahead and reserve one for you and Jason as well? We could make it a family trip. Our treat, of course." Her laugh tinkled through the phone. "Well, partially our treat. As Richard says, it's time for the younger generation to step up." The audacity was breathtaking. Not only were they proceeding with their expectation that I would fund their luxury vacation, but they were attempting to disguise it as a family bonding opportunity. "Actually, Eleanor," I replied calmly, using the techniques Caroline had taught me, "I have some important business matters to attend to today, but I'm planning to stop by your house this evening around 6 CUR. There's something I'd like to discuss with you and Richard. Jason will be joining us as well." "Oh?" The surprise in her voice was evident. I rarely initiated family gatherings. "What's the occasion?" "Let's just say it's time for some family transparency," I replied. "I'll see you at 6. Before she could press further, I ended the call and turned my attention to preparing for the Wellspring meeting. Today would unfold in 2 parts. First, securing EcoNest's future with a landmark distribution deal, and then, finally addressing the Foster family's financial expectations. By 9:30, I was dressed in a tailored navy suit, one of the few high-end pieces I allowed myself, though no one in the Foster family had ever seen me wear it. To them, I was always in casual business attire or weekend wear, never presenting myself as the CEO I actually was. Today, that changed. As I gathered my portfolio and car keys, I paused to look around the house that Jason believed we were still paying a mortgage on. The mortgage I had quietly paid off last year using a portion of my business profits. The home that, according to our carefully documented finances, was now 70% mine based on contribution, a fact Jason remained unaware of. Tonight, all the cards would be on the table. But first, I had a distribution deal to sign. The Wellspring deal was signed by 11:30 a.m., complete with handshakes, champagne, and press photos that would appear in tomorrow's business section. Marcus Reynolds had been effusive in his praise of EcoNest's product line and sustainable practices, noting that our reclaimed wood furniture was exactly what their customers had been demanding. "Your timing is impeccable, Morgan," he said as we walked to the elevator after the meeting. "The market for sustainable luxury has exploded. You're not just riding the wave, you're ahead of it." I thanked him and stepped into the elevator, feeling a curious blend of professional triumph and personal apprehension. In my professional life, I was respected, my vision valued, my expertise acknowledged. In just a few hours, I would need to transfer that same confident energy to my personal life, a much more complicated arena. On the drive back to my office, I called Zoe to share the good news. "We did it," I said simply when she answered. Her whoop of joy made me smile. "The papers are signed? It's official?" "Completely official. Wellspring is announcing it tomorrow. Initial order is even bigger than projected. They want to launch in all flagship stores simultaneously." "Morgan, that's incredible." Zoe paused. "So, are you telling Jason and his parents tonight as planned?" I took a deep breath. "Yes. Dinner. At their house at 6. I've asked Jason to meet me there." "How are you feeling about it?" I considered the question carefully. "Ready. It's been exhausting, maintaining this double life. Whether they react well or poorly, at least after tonight, I can be one consistent version of myself." "Call me afterward no matter how late," Zoe insisted. "Or if you need backup during, I'm just a phone call away." After hanging up, I stopped by my office to collect the additional documents I would need for the evening's conversation. Lisa had organized everything perfectly: financial records, property deed, business valuation, and the report from Diana Warren showing exactly how much money Jason had been diverting to his parents. At 5:45 p.m., I pulled up to Richard and Eleanor's sprawling lakefront home. Jason's car was already in the driveway. I had texted him earlier asking him to meet me there, saying only that we needed to have an important family discussion. His replied question marks had gone unanswered. I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. I was still wearing my navy suit from the morning meeting, with the addition of a simple pearl necklace that had been my grandmother's. Professional, polished, powerful, a stark contrast to the casual, accommodating daughter-in-law the Fosters were accustomed to seeing. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my portfolio and approached the front door. Instead of using my key or knocking tentatively as I usually did, I rang the doorbell decisively. Eleanor opened it, her expression shifting from a welcoming smile to confused assessment as she took in my attire. "Morgan, we weren't expecting such formality," she said, glancing pointedly at my suit. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Eleanor," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. "Where are Richard and Jason?" "In the living room having a drink." She followed me, her voice lowered. "Jason seems concerned. He said you've been acting strangely since Christmas. Is this about the Alaska cruise? Because really, dear, we're flexible on the dates." I didn't respond, walking instead toward the living room where the gentle clink of ice in crystal glasses announced the men's location. They both looked up as I entered. Richard comfortable in his leather armchair, Jason perched more tensely on the edge of the sofa. Both seemed taken aback by my appearance. "Morgan," Richard greeted me with his usual slightly condescending warmth. "You look like you've come from a board meeting." He chuckled at his own joke. "I have, actually," I replied calmly, setting my portfolio on the coffee table. "Though that was this morning. The afternoon was spent preparing for this conversation. Jason shifted uncomfortably. "What's going on, Morgan? You've been mysterious all day." Eleanor joined us, hovering by Richard's chair. "Can I get you a drink, dear? You seem so intense." "No, thank you," I said, remaining standing. I prefer to be clear-headed for this discussion. It's been a significant day. This morning, I signed a national distribution agreement with Wellspring, Cooperative for EcoNest products. A brief silence followed this announcement. Jason was the first to respond, his tone cautiously congratulatory. "That's great, honey. Wellspring is pretty big, right? That should bring in some nice extra income." Richard nodded approvingly. "Always good to see a small business gain some traction. Maybe now you can hire someone part-time to help, give you more flexibility for family matters." The implication being, of course, that my business should remain secondary to family obligations, specifically their needs. "It's more than some traction, Richard," I replied, opening my portfolio and removing the press release scheduled for tomorrow. I handed it to Jason, whose eyes widened as he scanned the document. This says EcoNest is valued at $15 million, he stammered. "And the initial order from Wellspring is, this can't be right." "It's entirely right," I confirmed, turning to include Richard and Eleanor in my gaze. EcoNest has been growing steadily, for years. The Wellspring deal is simply the most public recognition of that success. Eleanor took the paper from Jason's unresisting hands, reading it with growing disbelief. "But you never said anything. You always made it sound like you were just getting by." "Yes," I acknowledged. "I did. That was a deliberate choice based on how my business was received in this family from the beginning. But that's only part of why I'm here tonight." I removed additional documents from my portfolio, laying them neatly on the coffee table. These are records of our household finances for the past 8 years. They show exactly how much I've contributed to our shared expenses, mortgage, and savings. They also show, I continued, looking directly at Jason, the regular transfers you've been making to your parents over the past 2 years. The room went very still. Richard's face flushed dark red. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of shock. Jason looked as though I'd physically struck him. "You've been spying on my accounts?" he finally managed, his voice tight with anger. "No, Jason. I've been reviewing our financial records I have every legal right to see as your spouse. Just as you have legal access to my personal finances, though apparently you never bothered to look closely enough to realize what EcoNest was actually worth." I turned to Richard and Eleanor. "I understand that retirement hasn't worked out as planned for you financially. That must be difficult. What I don't understand is the expectation that I should fund your lifestyle without any discussion, especially when you've consistently treated my business as an inconsequential hobby." Richard stood up abruptly. "Now see here, young lady. Our financial situation is none of your business. If Jason chooses to help his parents, that's between him and us. It became my business," I replied evenly. "When it started impacting our household finances, and when you directly asked me to pay for your Alaskan cruise at Christmas. It became my business when Eleanor called this morning to follow up on that expectation." I removed one final document from my portfolio, the deed to our house. This is the deed to the home Jason and I share. As you can see, the mortgage was paid in full last year. What you may not know is that I paid it off using my business profits. Jason's face had gone from red to ashen. "That's impossible. We still have the mortgage payments." "No, Jason. You still make monthly transfers to an account you believe is our mortgage. I established that account after paying off the house, hoping we could have an honest conversation about finances before it grew too large. That account now holds over $30,000 that you believe has gone toward our mortgage. I've never touched it." I placed the account statement next to the deed. The silence in the room was deafening. "I'm not here to create drama," I continued, my voice softening slightly. "I'm here because it's time for financial honesty and clear boundaries. I've built a successful business while playing down my accomplishments to maintain family peace. That ends tonight." Eleanor had sunk onto the arm of Richard's chair, her usual poise abandoned. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why wouldn't you tell us about your success? We would have been proud." I looked at her directly. "Would you, Eleanor?" Because for 8 years, every mention of my business was met with dismissal or concern. It was my little project, my crafting hobby. Even today, when I announced a multi-million-dollar distribution deal, Richard's response was that I could hire part-time help. I turned to Jason, whose shock was giving way to a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully read. "And you, Jason. You went from being supportive to using my perceived lack of success as a punchline with your friends, all while knowing that your parents were in financial trouble and apparently expecting me to bail them out once my business finally succeeded." Richard had recovered enough to attempt regaining control of the situation. "Now wait just a minute. Nobody asked you to bail us out. We simply suggested that as family, we support each other. When Jason was growing up, we gave him every advantage. And he's repaid you," I interjected, pointing to the financial records. "Over $120,000 in the past 2 years alone. Money that was supposed to be going toward our shared financial goals, without discussion, without transparency." I took a deep breath, centering myself with the techniques Caroline had taught me. "Here's what's going to happen now. I'm establishing clear financial boundaries. I will not be funding luxury cruises, country club memberships, or any other expenses for Richard and Eleanor. Jason, you need to decide if you want to continue supporting your parents at the current level, but if so, it will be with complete transparency about where the money is coming from and what it's being used for." I gathered the documents back into my portfolio, leaving only copies of the most critical pieces on the table. "I'll be staying at my downtown office apartment for the next few days. That will give everyone time to process this information and decide how they want to proceed." Jason stood up, finally finding his voice. "You have an apartment downtown? Since when? What else have you been hiding?" "It's a corporate apartment for EcoNest," I clarified. "And I haven't been hiding anything. I've simply been managing my business and my finances with the same autonomy you've always assumed for yourself. The difference is that I'm now being transparent about it." I picked up my portfolio and looked at each of them in turn. Eleanor's shock, Richard's anger, Jason's confusion. I've valued this family for 8 years, despite often feeling dismissed and underestimated. I'm still committed to us finding a way forward, but it has to be based on mutual respect and financial honesty. I'm willing to have that conversation whenever you're ready. With that, I turned and walked out. The weight of years of pretense finally lifted from my shoulders. As I got into my car, I could see them through the living room window. Jason gesturing animatedly, Richard red-faced and pacing, Eleanor with her head in her hands. Whatever happened next would be difficult, but for the first time in years, I was moving through the world as one consistent, authentic self. And that alone was worth the upheaval to come. The next morning, I woke in my downtown apartment to the buzz of my phone. The Wellspring deal had been announced, and my email was flooded with congratulations from industry colleagues. EcoNest was trending in sustainable business circles, with projections about our growth and impact dominating the conversation. In stark contrast to this professional triumph, my personal phone showed missed calls from Jason, a terse text from Richard, "We need to speak in person," and a surprisingly thoughtful message from Eleanor. "I realize we have a lot to process. When you're ready, I would appreciate a conversation." I made coffee in the apartment's small kitchen, watching the morning light illuminate the city below. There was a curious sense of peace amidst the chaos. The relief of finally integrating the separate parts of my life into one authentic whole. Zoe called as I was responding to business emails. "The announcement is making waves," she said without preamble. Marcus from Wellspring just called. They want to feature your founder story in their summer catalog. How are you holding up after last night? I gave her a brief rundown of the conversation with the Fosters. It went about as expected: shock, denial, some anger. But also the beginning of recognition. It's too early to know where things will land. And Jason? Is he processing or spiraling? I sighed. His texts vacillate between apologies and accusations. Classic emotional whiplash when someone's worldview has been upended. I've suggested we meet with a financial counselor before having another private conversation, someone neutral to facilitate. Smart. Zoe approved. What about the in-laws? Any indication they're backing down on their expectations? Richard is still in fighting mode. Eleanor might be more reflective. Time will tell. After catching up on the most pressing business matters, I decided to respond to Eleanor's message, suggesting we meet for coffee the following day. To my surprise, she agreed immediately. The coffee shop I suggested was neutral territory. Neither the upscale establishments Eleanor preferred nor the eco-friendly cafes I typically frequented. When I arrived, she was already seated, looking surprisingly diminished without her usual carefully maintained facade. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down across from her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since your revelation." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "Not just for the expectations about money, but for dismissing your business all these years. It was short-sighted and, I realize now, probably hurtful." This was more self-awareness than I had anticipated. "Yes, it was hurtful," I acknowledged. "But I also made a choice to downplay my success rather than challenging your perceptions. That's on me." Eleanor twisted her wedding ring, a substantial diamond I knew from family lore had been upgraded 3 times during their marriage as Richard climbed the corporate ladder. "Can I ask why? Why you felt you needed to hide your success from us?" It was a fair question, one I had prepared for. At first, it was simpler to go along with your narrative than to constantly defend my choices. Later, when Jason's attitude changed and he began mocking my business with his friends, it became a matter of pride. And finally, if I'm being completely honest, it became strategic. I could see the financial expectations building, and I wanted to protect the business I'd worked so hard to build. Eleanor winced but nodded. Richard has always been controlling about money. It defined success for him. The right car, the right address, the right vacations. I adopted that value system without really questioning it. She paused, looking down at her untouched coffee. The truth is, we're not just struggling financially. We're drowning. This confirmed what Diana, Warren's analysis, had suggested, but hearing Eleanor admit it was still surprising. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. "Bad enough that we've taken out a reverse mortgage on the house. Bad enough that without Jason's help we'd have lost the country club membership last year. Richard would rather die than admit it, but we're one major expense away from real trouble." I absorbed this information, feeling a complex mix of vindication and genuine concern. "Eleanor, I'm sorry you're in that position, truly. But luxury cruises and country clubs aren't necessities. There are financial advisors who specialize in retirement readjustments." "Richard would never agree to that," she interrupted, a flash of the old Eleanor surfacing. "He's from the generation where financial problems are shameful, a personal failure. Seeking help would be admitting defeat." "Even if maintaining appearances leads to actual defeat?" I asked gently. She gave a sad little laugh. "Especially then. Image has always been everything to Richard. To admit he's mismanaged our retirement would destroy him." We sat in silence for a moment, the complexity of the situation settling between us. "I can't fund your current lifestyle," I finally said. "I won't, but I would be willing to pay for a financial consultant to help you develop a sustainable retirement plan." one based on your actual resources, not on Jason's contributions or expectations of my business success. Eleanor looked up, surprise evident in her expression. You would do that? After how we've treated you? I would do it because, despite everything, you're family. But it would come with conditions. Complete financial transparency. No more luxury expenditures until you're on solid ground. And most importantly, a new foundation of respect between us. For who I actually am. Not who you perceived me to be. She reached across the table, tentatively touching my hand. Jason is devastated, you know. Not just about the money, but about realizing how little he actually knew you. I know, I replied softly. That's a separate conversation we need to have. One that goes beyond finances to the heart of our relationship. As our coffee meeting concluded, Eleanor surprised me one final time. Your business, it's remarkable what you've built. I looked up EcoNest online last night. The products are beautiful, sustainable without sacrificing elegance. I never really looked before, just assumed. She trailed off, embarrassment coloring her features. I should have taken the time to understand. We parted with a tentative plan to meet again the following week, this time with a financial consultant I would arrange. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning. The first honest conversation we'd had in 8 years. That evening, Jason finally came to the apartment. I buzzed him up, steeling myself for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. When I opened the door, I was struck by how disheveled he looked, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and uncombed hair. I didn't know who you were, he said without preamble, standing awkwardly in the entryway. I've been living with you for 8 years, and I had no idea who you really were. I gestured for him to sit down. I could say the same about you, Jason. I didn't know you were funneling our money to your parents. I didn't know you were telling them about my business while mocking it to my face. He winced, sinking onto the couch. That's fair. More than fair. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from countless arguments over the years. But paying off our mortgage without telling me, having a secret apartment, building a multi-million-dollar company while pretending to struggle? Morgan, that's another level of deception. Is it deception to maintain privacy about my success when it was consistently diminished? I asked, keeping my voice level. Did you ever actually ask about EcoNest's financials? Did you ever show real interest in what I was building? He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. I assumed. I thought I knew. Exactly. You assumed, just like your parents assumed. And when my business didn't fit your assumptions, you all created a narrative that made sense to you. That I was playing at being an entrepreneur. That I needed your protection and financial stability. Jason was quiet for a long moment. I screwed up. Badly. But finding out everything at once in front of my parents. He shook his head. It was humiliating. I took a deep breath. I understand that. The public revelation wasn't ideal. But after years of having my work diminished by all of you, I needed to control the narrative. I needed all the cards on the table at once so there could be no more spinning, no more dismissal. What happens now? He asked, looking up at me with genuine uncertainty. With us, I mean. It was the question I'd been asking myself since walking out of Richard and Eleanor's house. That depends on whether we can build something new on a foundation of mutual respect and honesty. Not just about money, but about who we are and what we value. And if we can't? I met his gaze steadily. Then we'll need to have a different conversation. But I'm not there yet. Are you? He shook, his head slowly. No, despite everything, no. But Morgan, my parents really are in financial trouble. My dad made bad investments, refused to downsize their lifestyle when he retired. They're barely staying afloat. I know. Eleanor told me this morning. I've offered to pay for a financial consultant to help them create a sustainable retirement plan. What I won't do is fund luxury cruises or country club memberships. Those days are over. Jason looked surprised. You've already spoken to my mother? Yes, she reached out. We had coffee this morning. He absorbed this information, looking slightly disoriented by how quickly things were moving without his direction. And my father? Still angry from what I gather, but he'll need to come around if they want my help with the financial consultant. Jason nodded slowly. He's always been stubborn about money. It's his measure of success, of worth. I understand that, but it's not mine. And I won't pretend it is anymore, not even to keep the peace. For the next hour, we talked more openly than we had in years. Jason admitted to feeling increasingly inadequate as his career plateaued while my business grew, though he hadn't realized just how much it had grown. I acknowledged that maintaining the facade had become its own kind of prison, separating my life into compartments that could never truly connect. I need time, I finally said as our conversation wound down. Time to see if we can rebuild trust. Time to establish new patterns of interaction with your parents. And us living separately? Is that temporary or... He let the question hang. For now, it's what I need. Space to think without falling back into old patterns. I'll be staying here for at least a few weeks. As Jason left, I felt a curious lightness despite the uncertainty ahead. The truth, however painful in the moment, had created space for something authentic to potentially grow, if we were all willing to do the difficult work required. The next week brought a cascade of changes on both professional and personal fronts. EcoNest's distribution deal with Wellspring dominated industry news, bringing a flood of new wholesale inquiries and partnership opportunities. Zoe and I worked, long hours managing the sudden expansion, hiring additional staff, and securing larger production facilities. On the personal side, I arranged for Eleanor and Richard to meet with Diane Levine, a financial consultant specializing in retirement realignment. To my surprise, they both attended, though Richard maintained a stony silence throughout much of the initial session. This is unnecessary, he insisted, as Diane outlined her approach. We've managed our finances for decades without outside interference. And how is that working out? I asked pointedly, earning a warning glance from Eleanor. Diane, to her credit, remained professionally neutral. Financial circumstances change, especially in retirement. My role isn't to judge past decisions, but to help create a sustainable path forward based on current realities. Reluctantly, Richard agreed to provide their financial documents for review, though he insisted this was merely to prove there's no real problem. Eleanor's relieved expression told a different story. Jason attended the meeting as well, sitting beside me but maintaining a respectful distance. We had spoken briefly throughout the week, our conversations cautious but increasingly honest. He had begun individual therapy, he told me, to address patterns he was recognizing in himself. I never wanted to become my father, he admitted during one of our phone calls. But watching him my whole life, absorbing his values about money and success, it happened without me even realizing it. As the financial consultation progressed, Diane's professional demeanor gradually gave way to visible concern. The Fosters' financial situation was even worse than Eleanor had indicated. Their debt load was substantial, their investments underperforming, and their monthly expenses vastly outpacing their fixed retirement income. Without significant lifestyle changes, Diane concluded, looking directly at Richard, you'll deplete your remaining assets within 18 months. Possibly sooner if there are any unexpected medical expenses or necessary home repairs. Richard's face had gone pale. That's impossible. We've always lived well. Always. Living well and living within your means are not the same thing, Diane replied gently. The reality is that your current lifestyle is unsustainable without external support. Her eyes flicked briefly to Jason, acknowledging the role he'd been playing in propping up their finances. Eleanor reached for Richard's hand. "We need to listen, Richard. This isn't just going to go away." The plan Diane outlined was comprehensive, but difficult. Selling the lakefront house and downsizing to a smaller home, eliminating luxury expenses like the country club and annual international vacations, restructuring their remaining investments, and potentially even Richard taking on part-time consulting work to supplement their income. "This is humiliating," Richard muttered, refusing to look at me. "Having our financial failings dissected like this and by—" He stopped himself, but the implication was clear. Having his daughter-in-law, the same woman whose business acumen he had dismissed for years, witness his financial failure was particularly galling. "Richard," I said carefully, "this isn't about humiliation. It's about creating stability for your future. I'm offering to cover Diane's fees and to help you transition to a sustainable lifestyle. Not out of pity or to prove a point, but because you're family." He finally looked at me, his expression complex. "Why would you help us after how we've treated you?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past week. Because holding grudges doesn't align with who I want to be, and because I believe people can change when given the opportunity. As the meeting concluded, Diane promised to develop a detailed action plan based on the Fosters' financial documentation. Richard and Eleanor left looking shell-shocked, but, perhaps for the first time, facing reality. Jason lingered after his parents departed. "Thank you," he said simply, "for arranging this, for not leaving them to sink." "I wouldn't do that," I replied. "Despite everything, I wouldn't do that." He nodded. "I know. It's who you are, who you've always been, even when none of us were looking closely enough to see it." 3 days later, I received a text from Eleanor asking if I would meet with her and Richard privately. Curious, I agreed, suggesting a quiet restaurant near their home. When I arrived, I was struck by how different they both looked. Richard, always so carefully groomed and poised, seemed smaller somehow. The confident facade cracked to reveal the worried man beneath. Eleanor had abandoned her usual perfectly coordinated outfit and excessive jewelry for a simple dress and minimal accessories. "Thank you for coming," Richard began awkwardly after we'd ordered. "This isn't easy for me." I waited, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "I've spent my entire life believing that a man's worth is measured by his financial success," he said finally. "The right address, the right car, the right memberships. These weren't just luxuries to me. They were proof that I mattered, that I had achieved something." Eleanor placed her hand over his on the table. "We built our life around those beliefs. Questioning them now feels like questioning everything." Richard nodded. Diane showed us the projections. "If we continue as we have been, we'll be completely broke within 2 years, possibly homeless. At our age—" He shook his head, the fear evident in his eyes. "I never thought it would come to this." "It doesn't have to," I said gently. "That's the whole point of creating a new financial plan. Downsizing now means stability later. The thing is," Richard continued, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "we've already found a potential buyer for the house, a developer who wants the lakefront property. The offer is substantial enough to clear our debts and have something left to invest for a more modest retirement." This was unexpected progress. "That's a significant step," I acknowledged. "Have you looked at alternative housing options?" Eleanor nodded. "There's a lovely retirement community about 20 minutes from here. Nothing fancy, but well-maintained with good amenities. We're touring it tomorrow." Richard cleared his throat. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that we're taking Diane's advice seriously, and I owe you an apology, Morgan. A significant one." I raised my eyebrows, genuinely surprised. Richard Foster apologizing was unprecedented in my experience with the family. I dismissed your business from the beginning, he continued. Treated it like a hobby, something trivial. I did it because it didn't fit my understanding of success, corner offices and corporate hierarchies. I couldn't see that you were building something meaningful, something with actual value. That was short-sighted and, frankly, arrogant of me. It was, I agreed, not making it easier for him, but not being unnecessarily harsh either. The irony isn't lost on me, he added with a sad smile, that you've built something substantial and enduring while I was busy maintaining appearances I couldn't actually afford. You were the real business person at the table all along. Eleanor squeezed his hand supportively. We've been doing a lot of talking since the meeting with Diane, about values, about what really matters at this stage of our lives. And what conclusions have you reached? I asked. That we've been chasing the wrong things, Richard replied. Status, appearances, other people's approval. And while it's terrifying to let all that go, there's also a strange sense of relief, like we can finally stop pretending. I understood that feeling all too well. Authenticity is its own kind of freedom, I offered, even when it's uncomfortable. Richard nodded slowly. There's something else. I'd like to apologize to you properly in front of Jason for how we've treated you all these years and for the expectations we placed on you about funding our lifestyle. It was inappropriate and, looking back, embarrassingly entitled. This gesture, more than anything else he'd said, indicated a genuine shift. I appreciate that, Richard. It would mean a lot. As our meal progressed, I saw glimpses of different people emerging from beneath the polished exteriors Richard and Eleanor had maintained for so long. They spoke about friends they'd been afraid to see since retirement, fearing they couldn't keep up financially. They mentioned activities they'd enjoyed before status became their primary concern. Richard's love of fishing, Eleanor's abandoned watercolor painting. We could have a good life, Eleanor said thoughtfully. A different life than we planned, but maybe a more authentic one. You can, I agreed. And you don't have to face it alone. I meant what I said about being family. That hasn't changed, even if the dynamics have. As we parted ways, Richard surprised me with an awkward but genuine hug. Thank you, he said gruffly, for the wake-up call we needed, even if we fought it every step of the way. Driving back to my apartment, I reflected on how quickly things had evolved. The boundaries I'd established had been necessary, even overdue. But they didn't have to be walls. They could be clear delineations of respect and responsibility that actually allowed for healthier relationships to potentially develop. Jason was waiting at my apartment when I returned, sitting on the floor in the hallway outside my door. Sorry for just showing up, he said, standing as I approached. I've been thinking about us non-stop, and I couldn't wait any longer to talk. I unlocked the door, inviting him in. I just had dinner with your parents, I told him, dropping my keys on the counter. They're selling the house, looking at retirement communities. His eyes widened in surprise. Already? Dad agreed to that? More than agreed. They've found a potential buyer. They seem different. Like they're finally facing reality instead of fighting it. Jason sank onto the couch, processing this information. That's unexpected. Good, but unexpected. People can surprise you when their backs are against the wall, I observed. Sometimes crisis forces growth that comfort never would. He looked up at me. Is that what happened with us? Did it take a crisis to force growth? I considered the question seriously. Maybe. We'd settled into patterns that weren't healthy but were comfortable in their familiarity. Sometimes it takes something dramatic to break those patterns. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Jason said, his voice earnest. About us, about who I've been in this relationship. When I met you, I was drawn to your independence, your passion for your work. Somewhere along the way, I started resenting those same qualities, feeling threatened by them instead of inspired. "Why do you think that happened?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. He was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. I think I absorbed more of my father's values than I realized. Success became about appearances, about being the provider, the one in control. When your business started growing, instead of celebrating your success, I felt diminished by it. It's not something I'm proud of. His honesty was refreshing. And now? Now I'm questioning everything. What success really means. What I actually value versus what I was taught to value. Who I want to be as a partner, as a son, as a man. He looked up at me. "I understand why you needed space, why you're staying here. But I want us to try again, Morgan. Not picking up where we left off, but building something new, something better." I sat beside him, maintaining a small distance. "I want that too. But it won't be easy. Trust has been damaged on both sides." "I know. But I think what we could build now, with complete honesty between us, could be stronger than what we had before. If you're willing to try." "I am," I said, after a moment's reflection. "But slowly, with clear communication and expectations. No more assumptions, no more separate financial lives, no more diminishing each other's work." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Agreed. Completely agreed." As Jason left that evening, promising to call the next day to begin planning our path forward, I felt cautiously optimistic. The boundaries I had established weren't just about protecting my financial independence. They were about creating space for authentic relationships to potentially flourish, free from the distortions of false perceptions and hidden resentments. The next month unfolded in a whirlwind of changes. EcoNest's partnership with Wellspring exceeded even our optimistic projections, with our products selling out in multiple locations within weeks of launch. Zoe and I were working constantly, managing the expansion while maintaining our commitment to sustainable practices. On the personal front, Richard and Eleanor sold their lakefront home for a substantial sum, clearing their debts and purchasing a comfortable but modest condo in a retirement community with strong amenities and social programs. The transition wasn't without challenges. Eleanor struggled with downsizing decades of accumulated possessions, and Richard battled periodic bouts of resentment about their changed circumstances. But they were facing reality together, engaging with Diane's financial planning process with increasing openness. Most surprisingly, Richard began attending a support group for retired executives adjusting to fixed incomes, something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "It helps to know we're not alone," he admitted during a family dinner at their new condo. "So many of us made the same mistakes, prioritized appearances over security." Jason and I were rebuilding slowly, spending time together while maintaining separate residences. We had established complete financial transparency, creating new joint accounts while preserving appropriate independence. He had transferred to a different branch of his firm, wanting to advance through his own merit rather than his father's lingering connections. 6 months after the night I revealed my true financial situation, we gathered at Richard and Eleanor's condo for a holiday celebration. The setting was dramatically different from previous years' elaborate parties at the lakefront house, but the atmosphere was notably warmer, more genuine. Eleanor had embraced their new lifestyle with surprising enthusiasm, discovering a talent for creating elegant environments on a budget. She'd resumed her watercolor painting, converting the condo's small second bedroom into a bright studio space. Several of her works hung on the walls, revealing a sensitivity I'd never associated with my status-conscious mother-in-law. Richard had found purpose in unexpected places, volunteering as a financial literacy mentor at the local community college. If I can help even a few young people avoid my mistakes, maybe there's value in the hard lessons I've learned, he explained, a new humility evident in his manner. As we gathered around their dining table, smaller than their previous one, but perfect for the intimate setting. Jason raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, looking around at each of us. "To new beginnings, hard truths, and the courage to change. To boundaries that protect rather than walls that divide," I added, meeting his gaze with genuine warmth. Eleanor smiled, a natural expression that had replaced her once-practiced social mask. "To family, not as an obligation, but as a choice we make every day." Richard, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "And to Morgan," he said, surprising me, "for having the courage to speak truth when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo. Our lives are better for it, even if we fought the change every step of the way." As our glasses clinked together, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The boundaries I had established had indeed changed everything, not by creating distance, as I had initially feared, but by clearing away the falsehoods that had prevented genuine connection. With honesty had come the possibility of authentic relationships, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or illusion. Jason squeezed my hand under the table, a simple gesture of connection that felt more meaningful than any we had shared in years. "Thank you," he whispered, too softly for his parents to hear, "for giving us all a second chance." I squeezed back, recognizing that the challenges weren't over. Real change is rarely linear or complete. There would be setbacks, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But we had created a new foundation based on truth, and that made all the difference. As Eleanor served dessert, a simple but elegant tart she had made herself rather than the elaborate catered confections of previous years, conversation flowed naturally about plans and hopes for the coming year. Richard spoke about expanding his volunteer work, Eleanor about a local art show considering her watercolors. Jason shared news about a promotion at work, one earned through his own merit rather than family connections. When they asked about EcoNest, I shared openly about our growth and challenges, no longer downplaying my accomplishments or hedging my ambitions. They listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a new understanding of the business world beyond Richard's corporate experience. Later, as Jason and I drove home to my downtown apartment, which we had gradually been sharing more frequently, he reflected on the evening. They're different people. Or maybe they're finally their real selves beneath all the pretense. Maybe we all are, I suggested. When we stop performing for each other and start being authentic, it creates space for genuine connection. Do you think we would have gotten here without the confrontation, without you setting those firm boundaries? I considered the question seriously. No. We were all too comfortable in our assigned roles, even when those roles were making us miserable. Sometimes it takes a significant disruption to create the possibility of real change. Jason nodded slowly. You know, my father said something to me last week that I never thought I'd hear from him. He said he was proud of me for rebuilding our relationship on more honest terms, that it showed more courage than blindly following his example had ever required. I smiled, touched by this evidence of Richard's ongoing evolution. He's right. Examining inherited values and choosing your own path does take courage. You've done that beautifully. As we pulled up to the apartment building, Jason turned to me before shutting off the engine. Move back home, he said suddenly. Or I'll move here, wherever you want to be. I just don't want separate lives anymore. The request was unexpected, but not unwelcome. We had been gradually moving toward this decision for weeks, testing our new dynamic, ensuring the changes were sustainable. Are you sure we're ready? I asked, wanting certainty. I'm sure that I love the real you, not the version I thought you were or wanted you to be, but the accomplished, boundary-setting, truth-telling woman you actually are. I'm sure that the home we build now will be stronger for being founded on complete honesty. His sincerity was unmistakable. The man beside me was not the Jason who had mocked my business to his friends or expected me to fund his parents' luxury lifestyle. He had done the difficult work of examining his inherited values and choosing a different path. Okay, I agreed. But we design our life together intentionally this time. Equal partners with equal say. I wouldn't want it any other way, he replied, his smile reflecting a hard-won wisdom that had been missing before. As we walked hand in hand into the building, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. Standing up for myself financially hadn't just protected my business, it had created the possibility for authentic relationships across my family. The boundaries I had set hadn't limited connection. They had established the necessary foundation for genuine intimacy to finally flourish. 1 year after that pivotal night at Richard and Eleanor's lakefront home, EcoNest had grown exponentially, expanding into international markets while maintaining our commitment to sustainable practices. Jason had joined a different financial firm, one specializing in socially responsible investing, that aligned better with his evolving values. Richard and Eleanor had settled comfortably into their new lifestyle, finding unexpected fulfillment in simplicity and community engagement. And I no longer lived a compartmentalized life, pretending to be less to keep others comfortable. The integration of my personal and professional selves had brought a deep sense of authenticity to all my relationships. The mask I had worn for so many years was gone, replaced by the freedom of being fully known and, somewhat surprisingly, fully accepted. The financial boundaries I had established that night had indeed changed everything, not by creating distance, but by clearing away the falsehoods that had prevented genuine connection. With honesty had come the possibility of authentic relationships, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or illusion. As I prepared for a family dinner celebrating Eleanor's first gallery showing of her watercolors, I reflected on how setting those boundaries had been an act of love, not just for myself and my business, but ultimately for everyone involved. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer each other is the truth, even when that truth disrupts comfortable patterns and forces difficult growth. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when reconciliation seemed impossible. But standing firm in my worth and my boundaries had created space for something new and genuine to grow from the ashes of pretense. The financial honesty had extended to emotional honesty, strengthening bonds that had previously been based on performance and expectation. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Nervous about tonight? Thank you for encouraging me to pursue this. Never too late for new beginnings." I smiled as I typed my reply. "Never too late indeed. Your work is beautiful because it's authentic. Just like your life now." Setting boundaries hadn't been about shutting people out, as I had initially feared. Instead, it had been about creating the necessary space for everyone to become more fully themselves, more honest, more conscious, more authentic in their choices. And in that authenticity, we had found a deeper connection than performance and pretense had ever allowed. The luxury lifestyle my in-laws had demanded I fund had been replaced by something far more valuable: genuine relationships based on mutual respect and honest communication. In the end, that was the true measure of success, not the trappings of wealth or the performance of status, but the courage to live authentically and connect genuinely with those around us. As I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced transformation. Some lessons can only be learned through disruption, and some connections can only be formed when false expectations fall away. The financial boundaries I had set had changed everything, creating space for a life built on truth rather than illusion, a far greater luxury than any cruise or country club membership could ever provide. 3 years passed since the night I revealed my financial success to my husband and in-laws. What had begun as a necessary confrontation about financial boundaries had catalyzed profound transformation across our family system. The changes hadn't always been linear or easy, but they had been genuine and lasting. EcoNest had continued its expansion, becoming an industry leader in sustainable home goods with distribution across North America and growing markets in Europe and Asia. Our commitment to environmental responsibility remained central to our business model, even as we navigated the complexities of larger-scale production. The little project, once dismissed by my in-laws, now employed over 200 people and had been featured in major business publications as a model of sustainable growth. More meaningful than the business success, however, was the personal growth that had unfolded in unexpected ways. Richard and Eleanor's journey had perhaps been the most surprising. After the initial shock of financial restructuring, they had embraced their new lifestyle with increasing authenticity. Richard, once defined entirely by external markers of success, had discovered a passion for mentoring young entrepreneurs through a community program. "I spent decades chasing the wrong things," he told me over coffee one afternoon. "Now I get to help these kids define success on their own terms from the beginning." The man who had once mocked my little craft business now regularly asked thoughtful questions about EcoNest's growth strategy and sustainability initiatives. He had developed a genuine interest in environmental business practices, even organizing a green business forum at the retirement community where he and Eleanor lived. Eleanor's transformation had been equally significant. After decades of maintaining a perfect facade, she had discovered genuine joy in creative expression. Her watercolor paintings, initially a hobby to fill time in their downsized lifestyle, had developed into a respected body of work, with several pieces now displayed in local galleries. "I spent so many years worried about what other people thought," she reflected during one of our now regular lunch dates. "It's liberating to create simply for the joy of creation, without concern for status or appearance." More surprising still was the evolving relationship between Eleanor and Richard. Without the pressure of maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle, their partnership had softened into something more authentic. They argued more openly, but resolved conflicts more honestly. They laughed more frequently. The performative harmony of their previous life had been replaced by genuine connection, complete with the natural tensions and resolutions of a real relationship. Jason's journey had been perhaps the most profound. After our confrontation, he had embarked on a period of deep self-examination, questioning values he had absorbed without conscious consideration. Individual therapy had helped him identify patterns inherited from his father, measuring worth through financial success, equating leadership with control, viewing vulnerability as weakness. "I've been dismantling and rebuilding myself," he explained during a weekend hike, something we now did regularly to connect away from professional pressures. Examining each belief and asking whether it's truly mine or something I absorbed without questioning. This process hadn't been without pain. There had been difficult discussions about respect and partnership, about the unconscious ways he had diminished my work while elevating his own. There had been moments of regression when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves under stress. But his commitment to growth had remained steady, evidenced not in grand declarations, but in consistent daily choices. Most significantly, Jason had left his position at the corporate financial firm to establish his own practice focused on financial wellness and sustainability. His client base now included many women entrepreneurs, whom he approached with a humility and respect born of his own evolving understanding. "I listen differently now," he told me. "I don't assume I know what success means to someone else. I ask questions instead of offering prescriptions." Our marriage had transformed alongside these individual evolutions. We had rebuilt on a foundation of complete financial transparency, maintaining individual accounts while sharing joint financial goals and decisions. More importantly, we had established new patterns of communication based on genuine interest and mutual respect. The woman who had hidden her success to keep peace was gone, replaced by someone who spoke truthfully about both achievements and challenges. The man who had mocked his wife's business to elevate his own status was similarly transformed, finding confidence not in comparison, but in authentic connection. "I'm proud of you," became a phrase we exchanged regularly, not as a performative obligation, but as a genuine recognition of each other's growth and contribution. We celebrated each other's successes without competition, supported each other's struggles without judgment. On our 10th wedding anniversary, we gathered with Richard and Eleanor at our home, the same house where so much had been hidden, now filled with honest conversation and genuine connection. As we shared a meal on our back patio, surrounded by gardens planted after the confrontation as a symbol of new growth, I marveled at how profoundly our family system had transformed. "I have a confession to make," Richard said unexpectedly as we finished dinner. "I was terrified when you first confronted us about our finances. Not just because of the money, but because my entire identity was wrapped up in the lifestyle we could no longer afford." Eleanor placed her hand over his on the table. We both were. We'd spent so long performing success that we didn't know who we were without the performance. "And now?" I asked gently. Richard smiled, the genuine expression still somewhat surprising on the face that had once maintained such careful control. "Now I realize that the performance was exhausting. Living authentically, even with less, feels more like success than all the country clubs and luxury vacations ever did." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "I wish we'd learned that lesson earlier. Think of all the energy we wasted maintaining appearances, all the connections we missed because we were too busy performing to be present." Jason refilled our wine glasses, his movements relaxed in a way they hadn't been during the tense family gatherings of years past. I think about that too, how much I missed by focusing on how things looked rather than how they felt, including really seeing what Morgan was building with EcoNest. "We all missed a lot," I acknowledged. "But there's something powerful about choosing a different path, even if it takes a crisis to reveal the choice." As the evening progressed, our conversation flowed naturally between business discussions, personal revelations, and plans for the future. Richard shared insights from his mentoring work. Eleanor described her upcoming gallery exhibition. Jason outlined his vision for expanding his practice to include workshops on financial wellness. When they asked about EcoNest, I spoke openly about both our successes and challenges, the complexity of maintaining sustainable practices at scale, the ongoing negotiation between growth and environmental responsibility. They listened with genuine interest, offering thoughtful questions and occasional insights from their own experiences. After Richard and Eleanor departed, Jason and I lingered on the patio, watching fireflies illuminate the garden as dusk deepened into night. "Could you have imagined this 3 years ago?" he asked, his voice contemplative. "That confrontation leading to this?" I considered the question seriously. "No, I was prepared for boundaries to create distance. I never expected them to create space for deeper connection." That's the paradox, isn't it? Clear boundaries actually made authentic closeness possible. He squeezed my hand. "Thank you for having the courage to establish them, even when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo." As we sat in comfortable silence, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The financial boundaries I had established hadn't just protected my business and personal resources, they had created the necessary conditions for genuine transformation across our entire family system. The following weekend, I was invited to speak at a women's business conference about sustainable growth strategies. After my presentation, a young entrepreneur approached me during the networking reception, her expression both determined and uncertain. "Your story about building EcoNest is inspiring," she began. "But I'm struggling with something personal that's affecting my business. My in-laws and husband don't take my company seriously. And now that I'm starting to see real success, they've begun making financial demands that would undermine my growth. I don't want to damage family relationships, but I can't keep diminishing myself either." Her situation echoed my own experience so precisely that I felt an immediate connection. "What's your biggest fear about setting boundaries?" I asked gently. She hesitated. that I'll end up alone, that choosing my business means losing my family. I smiled in understanding. That was my fear, too. But I've learned something important about boundaries. They're not walls that separate us from others. They're the guardrails that make authentic connection possible. The young woman looked surprised. How can setting limits bring people closer? Because without boundaries, relationships become based on performance rather than authenticity, I explained. When I finally revealed my true financial situation to my family, it wasn't just about protecting my business assets. It was about refusing to continue relationships built on false perceptions. We found a quiet corner where I shared more details about my journey, from hiding my success to finally establishing clear financial boundaries. As I spoke, I recognized in her the same conflict I had experienced, the tension between honoring family connections and honoring her own worth. The hardest part was taking that first step, I admitted, being willing to risk temporary disconnect for the possibility of genuine connection later. But what I discovered was surprising. The boundaries I set didn't end relationships. They transformed them into something more authentic. She nodded thoughtfully. My husband keeps saying I'm being selfish for not helping his parents more financially, especially now that my business is growing. But if I divert the capital I need for expansion, it's not selfish to protect what you've built, I assured her. In fact, establishing clear boundaries now might actually save your marriage in the long run. Resentment from financial inequality can poison relationships in ways that are hard to repair. Did your husband understand immediately? She asked. I laughed softly. Not at all. There was anger, confusion, a sense of betrayal. On both sides, frankly. But once the shock wore off, it created space for honest conversation about expectations and values that we'd never had before. That was the beginning of genuine connection. As our conversation concluded, she squared her shoulders with new resolve. Thank you for being so open about your experience. It helps to know I'm not alone in this struggle. You're definitely not alone, I assured her. And remember, boundaries aren't about disconnection. They're about creating the conditions where real connection becomes possible. Walking away from that conversation, I felt a profound sense of how far I'd come, from the woman who hid her success to keep peace, to someone who could openly share her journey to help others find their voice. The following week brought an unexpected development. Jason received a job offer from a prestigious sustainable investment firm in San Francisco, an opportunity that aligned perfectly with his evolving professional focus but would require relocation. In our previous life, such a decision would have been fraught with unspoken expectations and assumptions. Now, we approached it with transparent communication. It's an amazing opportunity, I acknowledged as we discussed the offer over dinner. The firm's values align perfectly with your vision for ethical investing. Jason nodded. But EcoNest is here, with your production facilities and team. Asking you to uproot everything you've built feels selfish. Or we could look at it differently, I suggested. Maybe this is an opportunity to expand EcoNest's presence on the West Coast. We've been discussing a secondary headquarters there for distribution to Asia. The conversation that followed was a model of the partnership we'd rebuilt. Honest assessment of challenges, creative exploration of possibilities, genuine consideration of each other's needs. We ultimately decided to maintain our current home as EcoNest's primary headquarters while establishing a second residence in San Francisco. Jason would take the new position, and I would divide my time between locations as we expanded operations to the West Coast. When we shared the decision with Richard and Eleanor, their response reflected how much our family dynamic had evolved. That sounds like a thoughtful compromise, Eleanor observed. Both your careers advancing without either being diminished. Richard nodded in agreement. The Jason I raised would have either declined the offer to maintain control or accepted it, expecting Morgan to simply follow. This balanced approach speaks volumes about how your partnership has grown. His self-awareness was still sometimes startling. This new Richard who could reflect on his past patterns with clarity and choose different responses now. "We're not perfect at it," Jason acknowledged. "But we're learning to make decisions as true partners, not as competitors or with one person automatically deferring." As we implemented our bi-coastal arrangement over the following months, the strength of our rebuilt relationship was tested in practical ways. Managing EcoNest's expansion while establishing a new domestic rhythm required constant communication and adjustment. There were moments of frustration and miscommunication, but they no longer threatened our foundation because that foundation was now built on honest expression rather than performance and pretense. 6 months into our new arrangement, I was working late at EcoNest's original headquarters when I received an unexpected call from Richard. His voice held an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Morgan, I'm sorry to call so late. I've been thinking about something important, and it couldn't wait until morning." "Is everything all right?" I asked, concerned by his unusual urgency. "Yes, better than all right, actually. I've been meeting with my lawyer to update my estate planning, and I realized something I needed to share with you." He paused. 3 years ago, if someone had asked who my family's financial success story was, I would have pointed to myself without hesitation, despite the reality of our situation. I remained silent, sensing he needed to continue without interruption. Today, I helped a young woman in my mentoring program secure startup funding for her sustainable fashion business. As I was reviewing her business plan, I realized I was using principles I've learned from watching you build EcoNest, and it hit me. You're the true financial success story in this family, not because of the money itself, but because of how you've built something meaningful while maintaining your integrity. The acknowledgement was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. I wasted decades chasing status while accumulating debt, Richard continued. You built genuine wealth while creating something of real value. I just wanted you to know that I see that now, and I'm profoundly grateful for the wake-up call you gave us all, however uncomfortable it was at the time. As our conversation concluded, I sat in my office reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. The confrontation that had seemed so risky had ultimately created space for authentic relationships I couldn't have imagined possible with the foster family I'd first met 8 years earlier. The following weekend, I flew to San Francisco for Jason's first major presentation at his new firm. The event showcased his work developing investment strategies that prioritized environmental sustainability while delivering strong financial returns. Watching him speak with passion and expertise about values we now genuinely shared, I felt a depth of connection that our previous relationship, built on performance and hidden resentments, could never have supported. "What did you think?" he asked afterward as we walked along the Embarcadero, the Bay Bridge illuminated against the evening sky. "I think you've found your authentic voice," I replied honestly. "Not echoing your father's definition of success, not reacting against it either, but creating something genuinely yours." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "I couldn't have gotten here without the wake-up call you delivered 3 years ago. As painful as it was in the moment, it forced me to question everything I thought I knew about success, partnership, financial, responsibility, even my own identity. That questioning is what allowed us to build something real," I acknowledged. "Not perfect, but authentic." As we continued our walk, Jason shared details about a new client, a family-owned business transitioning to more sustainable practices while navigating complex family dynamics. "I understand their situation so much better now, having lived through our own transformation," he explained. "I can guide them with empathy rather than judgment." This was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of our journey. How our personal growth had expanded outward, influencing our professional approaches and allowing us to support others facing similar challenges. The boundaries that had initially seemed like potential walls had instead become the foundation for bridges connecting us not only to each other, but to broader communities. When we returned to our San Francisco apartment that evening, we found an unexpected package waiting for us. Inside was a beautifully framed watercolor painting from Eleanor, a landscape showing a path diverging through a garden, one route leading to a manicured but artificial-looking formal garden, the other to a wilder, more vibrant natural space. The accompanying note read simply, "Thank you for showing us a different path. With love and genuine gratitude, Eleanor." The painting now hangs in our home office, a daily reminder of the transformation that followed that difficult night of truth-telling 3 years earlier. It serves as a visual representation of how establishing clear financial boundaries changed not just our family's economic interactions, but our entire relational ecosystem. 5 years after the confrontation that transformed our family, EcoNest had expanded internationally, with sustainable production facilities in 3 countries and distribution across 4 continents. Jason's ethical investment practice had gained national recognition for pioneering approaches to socially responsible wealth management. Richard and Eleanor, now fully embracing their more modest but authentic lifestyle, had become advocates for financial honesty among their peers, even leading workshops at their retirement community about right-sizing expectations in retirement. The journey hadn't been without challenges. There had been moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, when financial pressures created tension, when different perspectives led to difficult conversations. But these challenges no longer occurred within a system of hidden resentments and performative harmony. Instead, they were addressed with the tools of honest communication and mutual respect that had become our family's new foundation. On the 5th anniversary of what we now sometimes jokingly called the intervention, we gathered at a small, sustainable resort on the California coast, neutral territory that represented our new shared values rather than any one person's domain. As we watched the sunset from the deck of our rented cabin, Eleanor raised her glass. "To boundaries that became bridges," she offered, her expression serene in a way it had never been during her status-conscious years. "And to Morgan, who had the courage to establish them when it would have been easier to maintain the peace. And to all of us," I added, "for being willing to grow through discomfort rather than clinging to comfortable illusions." As conversation flowed that evening, I observed the authentic connections that had replaced our formerly performative interactions. Richard discussing a mentee's business challenges with genuine interest rather than paternalistic judgment. Eleanor sharing her artistic struggles without concern for appearing perfect. Jason expressing work frustrations without competitive undertones. Later, as Jason and I walked along the moonlit beach, he reflected on our journey. "I was thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't confronted us that night, where we might be now." I considered the question seriously. Probably still trapped in the same patterns. Me hiding my success to avoid threatening your ego. You resenting my business while expecting it to fund your parents' lifestyle. Richard and Eleanor maintaining appearances while drowning in debt. All of us performing connection rather than actually experiencing it. "It's extraordinary how establishing financial boundaries ultimately created space for emotional authenticity," he observed, "as if one kind of honesty made other forms possible." "That's because money is rarely just about money," I replied. "It's about power, worth, identity, security. When we pretend about finances, we're usually pretending about deeper things too." As waves lapped at the shore, I reflected on the young entrepreneur I'd counseled at the business conference, wondering where her boundary-setting journey had led. Had she found, as I had, that the courage to establish clear financial parameters could ultimately strengthen rather than damage family bonds? Had she discovered the paradox that appropriate separation can create the conditions for genuine connection? The next morning, I received an unexpected email from Diane Levine, the financial consultant who had helped Richard and Eleanor restructure their retirement. She was organizing a book about financial wellness across family systems and wondered if we would be willing to share our story as a case study in transformation. When I raised the possibility with the family over breakfast, their responses revealed how far we had all traveled from that confrontational night 5 years earlier. As long as it might help other families avoid the traps we fell into, I'm willing, Richard said, the defensive pride that once defined him notably absent from his manner. It would have to address both sides, Eleanor added thoughtfully. Not just the importance of setting boundaries, but also the humility required to recognize when your approach to money has been unhealthy. Jason nodded in agreement. And the courage to examine inherited values rather than automatically perpetuating them. Their willingness to share our complicated journey publicly would have been unimaginable in our previous life, where maintaining appearances had been paramount. Now, authentic connection had replaced performance as our family's central value. As we collaborated with Diane over the following months to craft our story, the process itself became another opportunity for growth and integration. Articulating the complex dynamics that had led to that confrontational night helped all of us understand more deeply the patterns we had been trapped in and the transformation that had followed. What strikes me about your family's journey, Diane observed during one of our sessions, is how establishing clear financial boundaries ultimately created the conditions for emotional authenticity across the entire system. It's as if the financial transparency became a template for other forms of honesty. That's exactly it, Eleanor agreed, surprising me with her insight. Once the financial pretense was removed, other forms of pretense became impossible to maintain. It was like pulling a thread that unraveled the entire performance. The resulting chapter in Diane's book, titled From Boundaries to Bridges: How Financial Honesty Transformed a Family, became an unexpected catalyst for our next evolution. After its publication, we began receiving inquiries from financial advisors, family therapists, and business consultants interested in our experience. Almost without planning it, we found ourselves developing a workshop series that Jason and I co-facilitated, addressing the intersection of family dynamics and financial transparency. Richard and Eleanor occasionally joined as guest speakers, offering their perspective on the challenges of financial honesty in retirement. What began as a personal family crisis had evolved into a platform for helping others navigate similar waters. The boundaries I had established to protect my business and personal resources had ultimately created space for purpose and meaning none of us could have anticipated. 7 years after that pivotal confrontation, I found myself addressing a conference of women business leaders on the topic of financial boundaries as acts of love. Looking out at the audience of attentive faces, I recognized the mixture of determination and uncertainty I had once felt myself. Setting clear financial boundaries isn't selfish, I explained, drawing from our family's journey. It's an act of integrity that creates the possibility for authentic connection. When we pretend about money, hiding success out of fear, maintaining appearances we can't afford, expecting others to fund our lifestyle without discussion, we're usually pretending about deeper things too. As I shared our story, I watched recognition dawn in many eyes. Women who had diminished their success to maintain relationship harmony, who had funded extended family expenses without clear agreements, who had prioritized peace over authenticity until resentment threatened to consume them. The hardest part, I acknowledged, is taking that first step. Being willing to disrupt comfortable patterns, to risk temporary disconnection for the possibility of genuine connection later. But what I discovered, and what many of you might discover as well, is that boundaries aren't walls that separate us from others. They're the guardrails that make authentic connection possible. After my presentation, a woman approached me, her expression reflecting both determination and apprehension. "Your story resonated deeply with me," she began. "I built a successful tech company that my husband and his family still treat as my little startup, even though it now supports all of us. They expect access to company resources without accountability, and I've allowed it to keep the peace." I recognized in her the same conflict that had once paralyzed me, the tension between honoring family connection and honoring her own worth. What's your biggest fear about establishing clear boundaries? I asked. That I'll damage relationships beyond repair, she admitted. That choosing my business means losing my family. That was my fear too, I acknowledged. And I won't pretend the conversation is easy. But continuing as you are means building those relationships on illusion, rather than truth. Is that the foundation you want for your most important connections? As we continued talking, I shared practical strategies for approaching the difficult conversation ahead, preparing documentation, choosing an appropriate setting, focusing on future expectations rather than past resentments, being prepared for initial resistance before acceptance could emerge. The most important thing, I concluded, is remembering that authentic boundaries are ultimately acts of love, not just for yourself and your business, but for your family as well. You're creating the conditions where genuine connection becomes possible. Later that evening, I called Jason from my hotel room, sharing details about the conference and the conversation with the tech entrepreneur. She reminded me so much of myself 7 years ago, I explained. Caught between protecting what she's built and maintaining family harmony. What advice did you give her? He asked. To approach boundary setting as an act of love rather than conflict. To see financial honesty as the foundation for authentic connection rather than a threat to family bonds. Jason was quiet for a moment. It's remarkable to think about how differently we might have interpreted that advice 7 years ago versus now. Back then, I would have seen financial boundaries as selfish, as prioritizing money over family. And now? Now I understand that the boundaries you established were ultimately what saved us, not just financially, but emotionally and relationally as well. They forced us all to confront the illusions we'd been living under and create something more authentic in their place. As our conversation concluded, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The confrontation that had seemed so risky, so potentially damaging to family harmony, had ultimately become the catalyst for transformation beyond anything I could have imagined. 10 years after the night I revealed my true financial situation, to my husband and in-laws, we gathered for another family celebration. This time, the launch of a book Jason and I had co-authored titled Financial Boundaries, Authentic Relationships. The event was held at a community center where Richard now regularly mentored young entrepreneurs, a venue that reflected how completely our family's values had evolved. As I looked around at the gathered crowd, colleagues, friends, family, members, readers who had connected with our story through Diane's book or our workshops, I was struck by how completely the boundaries I had established had transformed not into walls, but into bridges connecting us to a broader community. Eleanor, now a respected watercolor artist with regular exhibitions in local galleries, had created the painting featured on our book cover, a powerful image of a bridge built on solid foundations spanning a deep chasm. The visual metaphor perfectly captured our family's journey from performative harmony to authentic connection, a journey made possible by the courage to establish clear boundaries. Even when doing so, disrupted comfortable patterns. Richard, looking relaxed and genuine in a way that still sometimes surprised me, introduced us to the audience with characteristic self-awareness. 10 years ago, I would have considered financial boundaries a threat to family loyalty, he acknowledged. Today, I understand them as the necessary foundation for genuine connection. This book represents a journey my entire family has taken from illusion to authenticity, from performance to true relationship. As Jason and I took the podium together, I felt profound gratitude for the transformation that had unfolded from that difficult night of truth-telling. What had begun as a necessary confrontation about financial boundaries had catalyzed growth none of us could have anticipated. Financial boundaries are rarely just about money, Jason explained to the attentive audience. They're about honesty, respect, and authenticity in our most important relationships. When we pretend about finances, hiding success out of fear, maintaining appearances we can't afford, expecting others to fund our lifestyle without discussion, We're usually pretending about deeper things too. The journey we share in this book wasn't always easy, I added. There were moments of profound disconnection before we could establish genuine connection. But what we discovered is that boundaries aren't walls that separate us from others. They're the guardrails that make authentic relationship possible. As questions from the audience explored various aspects of our experience, I was struck by how many people were navigating similar waters, balancing business success with family dynamics, establishing financial boundaries without damaging important relationships, moving from performance to authenticity in their connections. The most important lesson we learned, Jason reflected in response to one particularly thoughtful question, is that authentic boundaries are ultimately acts of love, not just for ourselves, but for our families as well. They create the conditions where genuine connection becomes possible. As the event concluded and we signed books for a line of engaged readers, I spotted a familiar face. The young tech entrepreneur I had counseled 3 years earlier at the business conference. She waited until the line had diminished before approaching, a copy of our book already in hand. "I wanted you to know that I took your advice," she said, her expression serene in a way it hadn't been during our previous encounter. "I had that difficult conversation with my husband and his family. It wasn't easy. There were tears, anger, accusations of selfishness. But ultimately, it forced us to build something more authentic." "And your business?" I asked. "Thriving," she replied with quiet pride. With clear boundaries established, I was able to focus on strategic growth without the drain of unexamined family expectations. But more importantly, my marriage is stronger, now that it's built on honesty rather than pretense. Her experience echoed our own so precisely that it felt like witnessing our journey reflected back from a different angle. The painful disruption of comfortable patterns had ultimately created space for genuine connection to flourish. Later that evening, as our family shared a quiet dinner celebrating the book launch, Eleanor raised her glass in a toast. "To Morgan," she said, her expression warm with genuine appreciation. "For having the courage to establish boundaries that ultimately became bridges. And to all of us," Richard added, "for being willing to grow through discomfort rather than clinging to comfortable illusions." As glasses clinked around the table, I felt profound gratitude for the journey we had traveled together. The financial boundaries I had established a decade earlier hadn't limited connection, as I had initially feared. Instead, they had created the necessary conditions for authentic relationships to flourish, not just within our family, but expanding outward to touch countless others navigating similar waters. What had begun as a necessary act of self-protection had ultimately become a catalyst for transformation far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The demand that I cover my in-laws' luxury lifestyle had been replaced by something far more valuable: genuine relationships built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared growth. As I looked around at these people who had once been trapped in patterns of performance and pretense, now engaged in authentic connection, I understood more deeply than ever before. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer those we love is the truth, even when that truth initially disrupts comfortable patterns. For it is only in that disruption that the possibility of genuine connection can emerge. The financial boundaries I had set had indeed changed everything, not by creating distance, but by clearing away the falsehoods that had prevented authentic closeness. In their place had grown bridges connecting us not only to each other, but to a broader community seeking similar transformation. And in that transformation lay the true measure of success, not in the trappings of wealth or the performance of status, but in the courage to live authentically and connect genuinely with those around us. 15 years had passed since that pivotal night when I revealed my financial success to my husband and in-laws. What had begun as a necessary confrontation about boundaries had evolved into a journey none of us could have anticipated, touching countless lives beyond our immediate family circle. EcoNest had grown beyond my wildest expectations, becoming a global leader in sustainable home goods with production facilities on 3 continents and a customer base spanning more than 40 countries. More importantly, we had maintained our commitment to environmental responsibility and ethical business practices despite the pressures of scale, establishing industry standards that other companies now strive to meet. The company that Richard had once dismissed as my little craft business now employed over 500 people worldwide and had been featured in major business publications as a model of sustainable growth with purpose. The reclaimed woodside tables he had once called garage sale material were now displayed in museums as examples of pioneering sustainable design. Jason's ethical investment practice had similarly flourished, expanding from individual clients to institutional investors, seeking to align their portfolios with environmental and social responsibility. He had become a respected voice in the sustainable finance movement, regularly speaking at international conferences and advising policymakers on incentives for ethical business practices. Our professional successes were meaningful, but the personal transformations remained the heart of our journey. Richard, now in his early 80s, had evolved from the status-conscious executive fixated on appearances to a thoughtful mentor, guiding young entrepreneurs toward measuring success. Beyond financial metrics, the man who had once demanded luxury cruises funded by others now lived contentedly in a modest retirement community, finding purpose in service rather than consumption. At 80, Eleanor had discovered artistic talents that had laid dormant during her decades of maintaining the perfect executive wife facade. Her watercolor paintings, begun as a hobby after downsizing their lifestyle, had developed into a respected body of work, featured in galleries and private collections. More importantly, she had found authentic joy in creative expression, a fulfillment that her previous pursuit of status had never provided. Our family dynamics had transformed alongside these individual evolutions. The performative harmony of our early years had been replaced by genuine connection, complete with the natural tensions and resolutions of authentic relationships. We disagreed openly, but resolved conflicts honestly. We celebrated each other's successes without competition. We supported each other's struggles without judgment. The book Jason and I had co-authored a decade ago, Financial Boundaries, Authentic Relationships, had found an unexpectedly wide audience, translated into 12 languages, and regularly featured in business school curricula and family therapy training programs. What began as our personal journey had become a resource for others navigating similar waters, a testament to how establishing clear boundaries could ultimately strengthen rather than damage family bonds. On the 15th anniversary of what we now sometimes called the financial revelation, we gathered at our home for a quiet dinner celebration. Looking around the table at these people who had once been trapped in patterns of performance and pretense, now engaged in authentic connection, I felt profound gratitude for the transformation our difficult journey had made possible. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," Richard said as we finished our meal, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that had replaced his former authoritative manner. Not the kind I once imagined. The impressive job title, the luxury address, the material markers of success, but the kind that matters when you reach my age and look back on the life you've lived. Eleanor nodded, reaching for his hand across the table. For decades, we measured success by what we had, rather than who we were. It took a significant wake-up call to recognize the emptiness of that approach. The wake-up call none of us wanted, but all of us needed, Jason added with a wry smile, gesturing around the table. "I sometimes wonder where we would be now if Morgan hadn't established those boundaries 15 years ago." It was a question we had considered before, but with the perspective of 15 years, the potential alternate trajectories seemed even more stark. Probably still trapped in the same patterns, I reflected. Me hiding my success to avoid threatening established dynamics. You resenting my business while expecting it to fund your parents' lifestyle. Richard and Eleanor maintaining appearances while drowning in debt. All of us performing connection rather than actually experiencing it. Richard shook his head slowly. The irony still strikes me. I spent decades chasing what I thought was success, accumulating debt to maintain appearances, while dismissing Morgan's business as insignificant. Yet she built genuine wealth while creating something of real value without sacrificing her integrity. You couldn't see it then because your definition of success was too narrow, Eleanor observed, her artist's eye for nuance evident in her perception. Success was a specific lifestyle, specific status markers. Anything that didn't fit that definition simply didn't register. That's the insidious nature of inherited values, Jason added. We absorb them so completely that we don't even recognize them as choices rather than objective truths. It took significant disruption for all of us to question what we'd been measuring our lives against. As our conversation continued under the warm glow of evening light, I was struck by how completely our family narrative had transformed. The story we now told ourselves and each other was no longer about maintaining appearances at all costs, but about the courage to live authentically, even when doing so disrupted comfortable patterns. I received a letter yesterday that I wanted to share with all of you, I said, retrieving an envelope from the sideboard. It's from Sophia Chen, the tech entrepreneur I counseled at that business conference 12 years ago. The one who was struggling with her husband's family's financial expectations? Eleanor recalled, her memory for personal details still sharp despite her advancing years. I nodded, opening the letter. She writes that her company has just been acquired for a substantial sum, a development made possible by the clear boundaries she established with her in-laws years ago. But more importantly, she says that the authentic relationships that emerged from that difficult conversation have been the true measure of her success. Another bridge built on the foundation of clear boundaries, Richard observed, referencing the metaphor that had become central to our family's understanding of our journey. As the evening progressed, our conversation turned to the workshops Jason and I still occasionally facilitated, helping other families navigate the complex intersection of financial dynamics and relational authenticity. What had begun as our personal crisis had evolved into a platform for supporting others through similar transformations. We're presenting at that financial therapy conference next month, Jason reminded me. The panel on family business succession planning and boundary establishment. I nodded, thinking of the families we would potentially impact. It still amazes me how establishing those financial boundaries 15 years ago created ripples that continue to expand outward, touching lives far beyond our immediate circle. Later, as Jason and I walked through our garden in the gathering dusk, he reflected on our journey. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from living authentically, isn't there? Not having to maintain different versions of yourself for different contexts. That's ultimately what those boundaries made possible, I agreed. Not just protecting my business assets, but creating space where we could all be fully ourselves rather than performing roles we thought we needed to play. The garden path wound through areas of carefully cultivated flowers and deliberately wild native plantings, a physical manifestation of our family's evolution from rigid expectations to authentic expression. Near the center stood a sculpture Eleanor had commissioned for our 10th anniversary, a bridge constructed of reclaimed materials from EcoNest's first workshop, symbolizing how our boundaries had ultimately become connective rather than divisive. As we paused by the sculpture, Jason's expression grew reflective. Sometimes I think about that younger version of myself, the one who mocked your business while secretly expecting it to fund his parents' lifestyle. I barely recognize him now. That's the nature of genuine transformation, I observed. Not just changing behaviors, but evolving so completely that your former self feels like a distant acquaintance. The following week brought an unexpected opportunity to witness the continued expansion of our journey's impact. A documentary filmmaker contacted us, interested in featuring our family's story in a series exploring transformative approaches to wealth and relationship dynamics. What makes your family's journey particularly compelling? The filmmaker explained during our initial meeting. is how establishing those financial boundaries ultimately strengthened rather than damaged your connections. That runs counter to the common fear that setting limits will end relationships. As we discussed the potential scope of the project, I was struck by the filmmaker's emphasis on the ripple effects of our experience, how our story had influenced others to examine their own financial and relational patterns, creating a cascade of transformations beyond our immediate circle. I've interviewed 3 families who directly attribute their own boundary-setting journeys to encountering your book or workshops, she explained. Each describes a similar arc: initial resistance and disconnection, followed by the emergence of more authentic relationships once the financial pretense was removed. The prospect of sharing our story in this format prompted deep reflection about the nature of our transformation. As we prepared for the initial filming session, we revisited key moments from our 15-year journey, considering what aspects might most resonate with others navigating similar waters. The hardest part to convey, I observed during a family discussion about the project, is how establishing those boundaries was ultimately an act of love rather than conflict. That setting limits wasn't about pushing people away, but about creating the conditions where authentic connection became possible. Richard nodded thoughtfully. From my perspective, the key insight was realizing that maintaining appearances, at the expense of financial reality, wasn't protecting my family. It was burdening them. Real protection came from facing the truth, however uncomfortable. Eleanor added her perspective. And for me, it was recognizing how much energy I'd been investing in performance rather than genuine connection. The boundaries Morgan established ultimately freed me from that exhausting pretense. Jason's insight particularly struck me. Looking back, I see that the boundaries weren't just about protecting Morgan's business assets. They were about protecting the integrity of our relationships from the corrosion of unexpressed resentment and unexamined expectations. As filming began the following month, our family's story unfolded through a series of intimate conversations and reflections on key moments from our journey. The documentary team captured Eleanor in her studio, paintbrush in hand, as she described, discovering authentic creativity after decades of performance. They filmed Richard mentoring young entrepreneurs, guiding them toward measuring success beyond financial metrics. They recorded Jason and me facilitating a workshop on financial boundaries as acts of love. What emerged through this process was a narrative more nuanced than I had anticipated. Not simply a before and after story of transformation, but an ongoing evolution with continued growth and occasional regression. Genuine progress punctuated by moments of falling back into old patterns. That's what makes your family's journey authentic, the filmmaker observed after a particularly vulnerable session exploring the challenges we had faced. It's not a tidy narrative of problem solved, but a messy, human process of continual growth and occasional stumbling. This perspective resonated deeply. Our transformation hadn't been a single moment of change, but an ongoing process of choosing authenticity over performance, honesty over harmony, genuine connection over comfortable illusion. The boundaries I had established 15 years earlier hadn't magically resolved all our challenges. They had simply created space where authentic engagement with those challenges became possible. During a break in filming, I found myself sitting with Eleanor in her small painting studio, watching as she added delicate brushstrokes to a watercolor landscape. At 80, her hand was less steady than in her younger years, but her artist's eye had only grown more perceptive with time. "I've been thinking about fear lately," she said without looking up from her work. "Specifically, the fear that kept us trapped in those old patterns for so long." "Fear of judgment?" I suggested. "Of not measuring up to some external standard?" She nodded, rinsing her brush in a jar of clear water that gradually clouded as she worked. "That certainly, but also fear of vulnerability, of being seen as we truly were rather than as we wanted to appear." Her insight struck me as particularly profound, coming from the woman who had once been so invested in maintaining a perfect facade. "And now?" I asked gently. Eleanor smiled, a genuine expression so different from the carefully practiced social smile of her earlier years. Now I understand that being truly seen, with all our imperfections and challenges, is the only way to experience genuine connection. The rest is just performance. Her words echoed in my mind as the documentary project continued over the following months, capturing not just our family's journey, but the ripple effects it had created through our book, workshops, and mentoring activities. The filmmaker expanded the scope to include interviews with families who had been impacted by our story, creating a tapestry of interconnected transformations. One interview particularly moved me, a conversation with Sophia Chen, the tech entrepreneur whose letter I had shared at our anniversary dinner. Now in her 40s with a successful exit from her company, she described how establishing financial boundaries with her husband's family had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged those relationships. The most surprising outcome, she explained, her composure occasionally giving way to emotion, wasn't just saving my business from being drained by unreasonable expectations. It was discovering that once the financial pretense was removed, we could build connections based on something more substantial than money. My father-in-law and I now have a genuine relationship that would have been impossible under the old dynamic. Her experience so closely mirrored our own that it felt like witnessing our journey reflected from a different angle. The same painful disruption of comfortable patterns, ultimately creating space for authentic connection to flourish. As the documentary neared completion, the filmmaker arranged a private screening for our family before the final edit. Watching our story unfold on screen, from the tension of that confrontational night 15 years earlier to the genuine connections that had gradually emerged from the disruption, was a profoundly moving experience. "It's strange seeing ourselves this way," Jason observed as the credits rolled. "Like watching characters in a story while simultaneously being those characters." "That's not far from the truth," Richard reflected. "In many ways, we were playing characters back then, roles we thought we needed to fulfill rather than being authentically ourselves." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "The performance was so complete that we had almost convinced ourselves it was reality. It took Morgan's courage to shatter that illusion and create space for something genuine to emerge." As we discussed our reactions to the film, I was struck by how completely our understanding of success had transformed over the 15 years since that pivotal confrontation. The external markers that had once defined achievement in our family, luxury, addresses, expensive vacations, country club memberships, had been replaced by measures more aligned with authentic well-being and meaningful contribution. "What constitutes success for you now?" the filmmaker asked as our discussion continued, her question directed to each of us in turn. Richard answered first, his response reflecting years of genuine reflection. "Connection," he said simply. "Not the superficial networking I once valued, but authentic relationship, the ability to be fully present with another person without judgment or performance." Eleanor's answer built on her husband's insight. "Creative integrity. Not producing art to impress others or achieve status, but to express something genuine, even if imperfect. The courage to create from authenticity rather than expectation." Jason considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "Integration," he finally said. "The alignment of values and actions, personal and professional. Success is no longer about achieving specific external markers, but about living with consistency across all domains of life." When the question came to me, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here, from the tension of hidden success and unspoken expectations, to the genuine connections that had gradually emerged through honest engagement. "Freedom," I answered. "Not just financial independence, though that's part of it, but freedom from the tyranny of appearances, from the exhaustion of maintaining different versions of yourself in different contexts. The liberty to be authentically yourself and to connect genuinely with others from that place of authenticity." The filmmaker nodded, clearly moved by our responses. That evolution in how you measure success is perhaps the most profound transformation in your family's story. Not just establishing different financial arrangements, but fundamentally reimagining what constitutes a life well lived. As the documentary moved into final production, our family continued the ongoing work of maintaining authentic connections in a world that often incentivizes performance over genuineness. The boundaries I had established 15 years earlier required regular reinforcement and occasional adjustment as circumstances evolved, a process that had become collaborative rather than confrontational. 20 years after that pivotal night of financial revelation, the documentary featuring our family's journey premiered at a film festival focused on transformative narratives. Titled Boundaries to Bridges, A Family's Journey from Performance to Authenticity, it received unexpected attention from both mainstream media and specialist audiences in financial therapy and family systems. As requests for interviews and speaking engagements multiplied, we were faced with decisions about how much of ourselves to share publicly. True to our evolution, we approached these decisions collaboratively, establishing clear boundaries about what aspects of our journey we were willing to discuss while maintaining privacy around more intimate details. It's a different kind of boundary setting, Jason observed as we prepared for a panel discussion following a screening of the documentary. Not about financial resources this time, but about narrative resources, which parts of our story belong to us privately and which parts might benefit others by being shared. This insight reflected how completely our understanding of boundaries had evolved over the 2 decades since that confrontational night. What had begun as a necessary protection of financial resources had developed into a nuanced practice of establishing clear parameters in multiple domains, emotional, relational, narrative, to create space for authentic connection rather than performance. The panel discussion that evening brought together our family with 2 others featured in the documentary, creating a rich exploration of how establishing clear boundaries had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged their most important relationships. As the conversation unfolded, I was struck by the common thread running through each family's experience. The initial fear that setting limits would end relationships, followed by the discovery that those limits actually created the conditions where genuine connection could flourish. The most counterintuitive lesson for us, shared the father from one of the other families, was realizing that appropriate separation was actually necessary for healthy closeness. Without clear boundaries, we weren't really connecting at all, just performing roles we thought we needed to play. His insight resonated deeply with our experience. The boundaries I had established 20 years earlier hadn't limited connection, as I had initially feared. Instead, they had created the necessary conditions for authentic relationships to develop, not just within our family, but expanding outward to touch countless others navigating similar waters. As the event concluded and we prepared to depart, a young woman approached me, her expression reflecting both determination and apprehension. "Your story has given me courage," she began. "I'm building a company that my partner's family still dismisses as my cute little business, even though it's now supporting all of us. They expect access to company resources without accountability, and I've allowed it to keep the peace." I recognized in her the same conflict that had once paralyzed me, the tension between honoring family connection and honoring her own worth. "What's your biggest fear about establishing clear boundaries?" I asked, echoing the question that had helped me understand my own hesitation decades earlier. "That I'll damage relationships beyond repair," she admitted. "That choosing my business means losing my family." "That was my fear too," I acknowledged. "And I won't pretend the conversation is easy. But continuing as you are means building those relationships on illusion rather than truth. Is that the foundation you want for your most important connections?" As our conversation continued, I shared practical strategies for approaching the difficult conversation ahead, preparing documentation, choosing an appropriate setting, focusing on future expectations rather than past resentments, being prepared for initial resistance before acceptance could emerge. The most important thing to remember, I concluded, is that authentic boundaries are ultimately acts of love, not just for yourself and your business, but for your family as well. You're creating the conditions where genuine connection becomes possible. Looking into her eyes, I saw reflected the same determination and apprehension I had felt 20 years earlier, standing at the threshold of a necessary confrontation that would ultimately transform not just financial arrangements, but entire relationship dynamics. In that moment, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me from that place of fear to my current capacity to support others facing similar challenges. Later that evening, as our family shared a quiet dinner discussing the events of the day, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To Morgan," he said, his expression warm with genuine appreciation, "for having the courage to establish boundaries that ultimately became bridges. And to all of us," Eleanor added, "for being willing to grow through discomfort rather than clinging to comfortable illusions." As glasses clinked around the table, I felt profound gratitude for the journey we had traveled together. The financial boundaries I had established 2 decades earlier hadn't limited connection, as I had initially feared. Instead, they had created the necessary conditions for authentic relationships to flourish, not just within our family, but expanding outward to touch countless others navigating similar waters. What had begun as a necessary act of self-protection had ultimately become a catalyst for transformation far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The demand that I cover my in-laws' luxury lifestyle had been replaced by something far more valuable: genuine relationships built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared growth. As I looked around at these people who had once been trapped in patterns of performance and pretense, now engaged in authentic connection, I understood more deeply than ever before. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer those we love is the truth, even when that truth initially disrupts comfortable patterns. For it is only in that disruption that the possibility of genuine connection can emerge. The financial boundaries I had set had indeed changed everything, not by creating distance, but by clearing away the falsehoods that had prevented authentic closeness. In their place had grown bridges connecting us not only to each other, but to a broader community seeking similar transformation. And in that transformation lay the true measure of success, not in the trappings of wealth or the performance of status, but in the courage to live authentically and connect genuinely with those around us. 25 years had passed since that pivotal night when I revealed my financial success to my husband and in-laws. What began as a necessary confrontation about boundaries had grown into a legacy that continued to expand in ways none of us could have anticipated. Last month, we celebrated Richard's 85th birthday in the community garden he had helped establish at his retirement complex. The man who once measured success by luxury cruises and country club memberships now found joy in teaching neighborhood children how to grow vegetables in sustainable raised beds. His weathered hands, once manicured for corporate boardrooms, now wore soil with pride as he guided small fingers in planting seedlings. "The irony isn't lost on me," he mused, as we walked through the thriving garden after the celebration. "I spent decades accumulating things I thought would bring fulfillment, only to discover it was in giving rather than acquiring that I found genuine purpose." His journey from status-obsessed executive to community elder had been neither quick nor linear. There had been periods of resentment after the initial financial restructuring, moments of regression when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But the boundaries I had established all those years ago had created space where authentic growth became possible rather than performative adjustments. Eleanor, at 85, continued to surprise us with her creative evolution. What had begun as watercolor painting had expanded to include pottery, textile arts, and most recently, digital art created on a tablet Jason had given her for her birthday. The woman who had once been defined by her perfect hostess persona now reveled in messy creativity, her studio a riot of colors and textures that reflected her liberated spirit. "I wasted so many years worried about appearances," she told me recently while showing me her latest work, an abstract exploration of transformation utilizing materials reclaimed from her former life of luxury. Imagining what others thought of me instead of discovering what I actually thought and felt and wanted to express. The documentary about our family's journey had eventually won several awards and been incorporated into curricula for financial therapy training programs, family, business courses, and workshops on authentic communication. More meaningful than the accolades had been the letters we continued to receive from people who had found courage through our story to establish their own necessary boundaries. Jason and I had gradually stepped back from active management of our respective businesses, transitioning leadership to younger generations while maintaining advisory roles. EcoNest had expanded beyond home goods to sustainable building materials and architectural consulting, while Jason's ethical investment practice had evolved into a foundation supporting entrepreneurs committed to environmental and social responsibility. Our professional legacies were gratifying, but it was the personal transformations that continued to bring the deepest satisfaction. The boundaries I had established 25 years earlier hadn't just protected my business assets. They had created space where authentic relationships could flourish, where genuine purpose could emerge from beneath the weight of inherited expectations and performative success. Looking back across the quarter century since that confrontational night, I could trace how establishing those financial boundaries had ultimately created the conditions for transformation in multiple domains, not just in our family's economic arrangements, but in our understanding of success, purpose, connection, and legacy. The young tech entrepreneur I had counseled years earlier, Sophia Chen, had eventually joined our foundation's board, bringing her unique perspective on navigating the intersection of business success and family dynamics. Together, we had developed programs specifically supporting women entrepreneurs facing resistance from family systems that prioritized harmony over authenticity, peace over truth. The most valuable thing you taught me, Sophia reflected during a recent board meeting, wasn't just about protecting my business assets. It was understanding that clear boundaries are ultimately acts of love, creating space where authentic connection becomes possible rather than performance and pretense. Her insight echoed the central revelation of our family's journey, that the boundaries I had feared would damage relationships had ultimately been the foundation for their transformation into something genuine and sustainable. Last spring, Jason and I celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary with a small gathering at our home. Looking around at our assembled loved ones, Richard and Eleanor, colleagues who had become friends, mentees who had become peers, I was struck by how completely our understanding of family had expanded beyond biological connection to encompass genuine relationship founded on mutual respect and authentic communication. If you had told me 30 years ago that establishing clear financial boundaries would ultimately strengthen rather than damage our most important relationships, I wouldn't have believed it possible, Jason observed as we shared quiet reflection after our guests had departed. I was so trapped in the narrative that love meant access without limits, that family meant resources without accountability. We all were, I acknowledged. Each in our own way, we had internalized values that equated financial boundaries with rejection rather than respect, limitation rather than love. As our conversation continued under the gentle evening light, we reflected on how completely our measures of success had transformed through this journey. The external markers that had once defined achievement in our family, the right address, the right vacations, the right possessions, had been replaced by measures more aligned with authentic well-being and meaningful contribution. What constitutes success for you now? I asked Jason, curious about his current perspective 25 years into our transformed journey. He considered the question thoughtfully. Congruence, he finally said. Living in alignment with my deepest values rather than inherited expectations. Being the same person across contexts rather than performing different roles for different audiences. His answer resonated deeply with my own evolution. The woman who had hidden her success to keep peace had been replaced by someone committed to authentic expression, even when it disrupted comfortable patterns. The boundaries that had once seemed like potential walls had become the foundation for bridges, connecting us not only to each other but to a broader community seeking similar transformation. This past summer, we received an unexpected invitation to speak at a global conference on the future of family wealth. A gathering bringing together financial advisors, family therapists, and wealth management professionals to explore more holistic approaches to intergenerational assets and relationships. Your family's journey offers a compelling case study in how establishing clear financial boundaries can ultimately strengthen rather than damage family connections, the conference organizer explained during our preliminary discussion. We'd like you to share not just what you did, but how that process transformed your understanding of success, purpose, and legacy. As we prepared for the conference, our family engaged in deep reflection about the evolving nature of our transformation. What had begun as a necessary confrontation about financial boundaries had developed into an ongoing practice of establishing clear parameters in multiple domains, emotional, relational, creative, to create space for authentic expression rather than performance. The boundaries themselves evolved as we did, Richard observed during one of our planning discussions, his insight reflecting decades of genuine self-examination. From Morgan's initial financial limits to protect her business, to emotional boundaries that protected authentic expression, to creative boundaries that allowed each of us to define success on our own terms. Eleanor built on her husband's insight. And with each evolution, we discovered more freedom rather than less connection. It's still counterintuitive to me sometimes that appropriate separation was actually necessary for genuine closeness. At the conference, our family panel drew unexpected attention from both traditional wealth management professionals and younger practitioners seeking more integrated approaches to family dynamics and financial well-being. The questions that followed our presentation revealed how many families were struggling with similar tensions between maintaining harmony and establishing necessary boundaries. How do you overcome the fear that setting limits will end relationships? Asked one participant, her question reflecting the same apprehension that had once paralyzed me. You don't overcome the fear, I acknowledged. You act with courage despite it. The fear that establishing boundaries will damage relationships is real and valid. What I discovered was that continuing without boundaries, guaranteed those relationships, would remain based on performance rather than authenticity. Another question came from a financial advisor working with family businesses. How do you help clients distinguish between genuine familial obligation and inappropriate financial expectations? Jason addressed this one, drawing from his decades of experience in ethical financial guidance. By focusing on intention rather than transaction, is the expectation coming from a place of genuine need and mutual respect, or from entitlement and one-sided benefit? Does it acknowledge the autonomy of all parties, or does it assume access without accountability? As the conference concluded, we were approached by countless individuals sharing their own stories of struggling to establish necessary boundaries while maintaining family connection. Some had successfully navigated similar waters, while others were still gathering courage for difficult conversations ahead. What struck me most powerfully through these interactions was how universal our family's journey had proven to be. The specific circumstances varied widely. Different cultures, different financial situations, different family structures. But the core tension between authenticity and harmony, between necessary boundaries and feared rejection, resonated across these apparent differences. A month after the conference, we received word that the documentary about our family's journey was being incorporated into a university course on financial therapy and family systems, bringing our experience to a new generation of professionals working at the intersection of financial well-being and relational health. The professor developing the curriculum requested a brief video addressing students directly, sharing what we considered the most important insight from our 25-year transformation. After careful consideration, our family gathered to record a simple message distilling what we had learned through this extended journey. Richard spoke first, his voice carrying the wisdom of genuine transformation rather than theoretical understanding. The most counterintuitive lesson for me was discovering that appropriate separation was necessary for authentic connection. Without clear boundaries, we weren't really relating at all, just performing roles we thought we needed to play. Eleanor followed, her artist's perspective bringing a different dimension. Financial boundaries were just the beginning. Once, we started being honest about money. We found courage to be honest about deeper things, our fears, our disappointments, our genuine desires. The financial truth-telling created a template for emotional truth-telling. Jason added his insight. What I've learned is that genuine love includes limits. The narrative that family means unlimited access to resources without accountability isn't about love at all. It's about control and appearance. Real relationship respects the autonomy of each person involved. When my turn came, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here, from the tension of hidden success and unspoken expectations to the genuine connections that had gradually emerged through honest engagement. The boundaries I established weren't walls to keep people out, but guardrails that made authentic relationship possible. They weren't about rejection, but about creating the conditions where genuine connection could flourish. As we concluded the recording, I felt profound gratitude for the transformation our difficult journey had made possible. The financial boundaries I had established 25 years earlier hadn't limited connection, as I had initially feared. Instead, they had created the necessary conditions for authentic relationships to develop, not just within our family, but expanding outward to touch countless others navigating similar waters. What had begun as a necessary act of self-protection had ultimately become a catalyst for transformation far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The demand that I cover my in-laws' luxury lifestyle had been replaced by something far more valuable. Genuine relationships built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared growth. As I looked around at these people who had once been trapped in patterns of performance and pretense, now engaged in authentic connection, I understood more deeply than ever before. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer those we love is the truth, even when that truth initially disrupts comfortable patterns. For it is only in that disruption that the possibility of genuine connection can emerge. The financial boundaries I had set had indeed changed everything, not by creating distance, but by clearing away the falsehoods that had prevented authentic closeness. In their place had grown bridges connecting us not only to each other, but to a broader community seeking similar transformation. And in that transformation lay the true measure of success. Not in the trappings of wealth or the performance of status, but in the courage to live authentically and connect genuinely with those around us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.